She presents pretty much every year at least one program at Wilderness Wildlife. She's involved in Quilt Fest, she's a storyteller, she's a local tour guide, just all kinds of wonderful things. So we're excited to have her. Here's Miss Kathy Gwinn.
Thank you so much, Christina. I told Marcia I thanked her for letting me come and do this presentation of the 250th, because I said, chances are there's a pretty good chance I won't be around in 2076. Well, you know what? When I thought about this, I thought about when I was 16 years old and I was watching the bicentennial of 1976, and Gerald Ford was the president, and we had just come out of Watergate a couple years before. And I thought about that because it made me think that was a hard time for America. It was a very divided, weak time. But then with the celebration of 76, that really was a great spurt for patriotism and unifying our country. And the question came to my mind, well, 250, does it have the potential to do the same thing for America? I sure hope it does or can. But because we all want to be good citizens and celebrate our country, but we also have to be realistic. And it's very sad to say, because we are in a time where as a country we are very, very divided. I used to teach history. I taught American history and government. And I have to say the Founding Fathers, as writers and as statesmen, were some of my favorite. I want to give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He once wrote about himself and the other Founding Fathers. He said, "Not one of us is perfect. No, not one. We are revolting." And they were. But not in the sense that we use that revolting word today, like disgusting. They were revolting. And revolt, that word comes from a Latin word that means to literally turn over, to change in a very, very dramatic way, and to turn something completely upside down. And that is what our Founding Fathers, the revolutionaries, were really, truly doing. With a revolt, you have a whole new way of looking at life, looking at your responses to life, how you perceive things. And for them especially, they were re-evaluating the way people had been literally governed for hundreds and upon hundreds of years. So the revolutionaries had several questions. And you can imagine sometimes they were maybe plagued with the path that they were going down. Is it the absolute best path, the right path? And so they would ask themselves, is democracy truly, truly possible? Another question, in a country this size, is self-governing even a possibility? Is human nature noble enough to govern itself? Those were very, very difficult questions, and nobody, in all honesty, could answer those questions with 100% certainty. Because in terms of governing, we were looking at a whole new paradigm. And so I say all of that for us to appreciate the trepidation that they must have felt at different times. I taught Reformation history, and I taught it at our local university. And the more I taught it, the more I began to appreciate the trepidation, the weight on Martin Luther's shoulders. He said, sometimes the thought would come to me, what if I am wrong? What if I am leading a whole group of people down the wrong path? Well, there were times our founding fathers also had that concern. Another reason that would cause them some trepidation, when we think back of colonial America and these times, the revolutionaries made up 1/3 of the total population of the 2.5 million people living in the colonies at that time. 1/3 were revolutionaries. Another third were loyalists. They supported King George, England, the crown, and all that meant. And then another third were totally neutral. So for men like Thomas Jefferson, was it truly right for them if they were trying to force or push this idea of independence upon the people? Because would not that totally fly in the face of democracy and the values that they were really trying to instill? And so, as I get started, I want to paint a picture that this was not easy. And there's always, when you have a big change and a new way of looking at things and turning them over, there's always trepidation involved with that. But one thing that perhaps really helped, I would say, our founding fathers and the revolutionaries, is that the more the colonists lived in this new land, the more they were becoming distinctly American. So think about it. You come over to this new land, and all of a sudden, there's new crops, there's new foods that you had never been exposed to. There's whole different species of trees and plants. There's new types of animals. There's completely new landscapes. Plus, there was the experience they had of crossing the ocean. That in itself would change them. Plus, once they got here, they were now to interact with a group of indigenous people. And now it was time to tame a wilderness. All those things, and nobody in England could relate to them. You have a whole gamut of new experiences and new surroundings. Think about it. New experiences necessitate new responses, new ways of thinking, right? And in that process, we forge a whole new American character and psyche. And so as this happens, England and its people are less and less able to identify with what we call these new Americans. I'll tell you, last summer, my husband and I, we went to Austria and the Czech Republic and Hungary. And I love to go to Europe because I love old things. My husband says he's grateful for that, which is ironic. I'm older than him, but anyway. But we went to many old cities, fortified cities that were from the 800s and 900s. And they would have ramparts, they would have the old city gates, the cobblestone streets. They'd still have the old powder magazines where years and years ago all of your ammunition was stored. And what amazed me more than the fact of how old they were is how well preserved they were. And I turned to Mike and I said, you know what? Us Americans don't preserve anything. And I realized that in our American character and development, preservation did not really start as a value part of our character or our country. And think about it. If you move into a new wilderness and you basically got as much room as you want to take, and you can eventually manifest destiny, go from coast to coast, they weren't as concerned about just preserving this one little street, this one small little town, and we have no room to grow. So we've got to keep these buildings up. We've got to keep this cathedral up in our streets because room was of the essence. They were preservationists. But we didn't have that issue here. But then also there's another thing that probably makes us uniquely American and lacking in a strong preservationist attitude. And that is the fact that a whole grouping of people who have in their mind and the wherewithal to say, you know what, we're going to pick up everything. We're going to pull up all our stakes and we are going on to a new land that we've never seen, we've never known before. That's the type of people Americans were. And you know, when we got here, we realized out of survival mode, we would have to put practicality over protocol. We'd have to put function over form, and we'd have to put expediency over tradition. And those things are what were woven into our character in the very beginning of the formation of our country to make us uniquely American. So that may be part of the reason we're a Walmart people. Or a Walmart generation. That was a lot of philosophy you're thinking just to get to that point. But what I want to do is talk about the Revolution and colonial times and how even the response to Britain and to increased taxation became a uniquely American response. And probably one of the very, very best examples of this is the Boston Tea Party. Now, Britain had just raised another tax, one of many. This time it would be on tea. And they were putting a new tax of 1 penny per pound of tea. Now, even in the 1770s, think about it. Was that outrageous? Absolutely not. But boy, did it create a stir. And in fact, how did the Boston colonialists respond? In a very, very American way. What did they do? They painted their faces red, they put some feathers in their hair, and then they got some blankets from the Mohawk tribe and put them around their shoulders. Try doing that in England. Uniquely American. But another reason it was a very, very uniquely American response. Almost 20 years before this, the American colonies were involved in the French and Indian War. And just a little short recap on that. That was between France and England, and those two countries wanted to have dominion and rule the Northwest Territory, basically Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And they were fighting over that. Well, the colonists that time were involved in that war with England. And there was a British surgeon who in 1755 wrote a song. You would know it today. It is called Yankee Doodle Dandy. And what this doctor was basically saying to these ragtag colonialists who thought they were some type of soldier, he was saying, oh, you Americans, you're doodles. Because in England, what was a doodle? A doodle was a simpleton, a lowlife, a nobody. Yankee Doodle. He said those Americans, those soldiers, they think all they need to do is put a feather in their cap, and lo and behold, they'll become a macaroni. A macaroni was someone in England of great, great breeding. Had quite the background in terms of their heritage, aristocrats, years of culture, education. And he said, you can't do that. So, by the colonists sticking a feather in their hair at the Boston Tea Party, it was also a rejection of that song, Yankee Doodle Dandy. But the Boston Tea Party, I want to share two things, why tea and why Boston, okay? And if you guys have questions along the way, please do feel free. But I will tell you this, I was on a bus today, and talking away, just yapping away, and I said, are there any questions? And a lady was about to raise her hand and ask a question, and her husband gave her a good nudge, and she said, oh, please, honey. It will only encourage her. So anyway, but why tea? Britain had started almost 10 years earlier with the Stamp Act of putting a tax on newspapers, on cards, on letters. And there were many taxes since then. So why did they get so outraged about tea that it was enough to cause this tea party? Well, if we were living at this time, we would realize that tea was very, very British. Everything about tea said Britain, okay? It said, I had a British upbringing, a British past. I know British protocol and traditions. This is something that I have inherited, and it's something I'm continuing. So tea said British. So it became actually a political commodity, and if you wanted to support the colonies and America, then it was un-American to drink tea. So you better find a substitute quick, all right? What were your substitutes? Probably coffee, but also they were making blackberry tea, a raspberry tea, and they also would use goldenrod. If you did any one of these substitutes, you were drinking liver tea, okay? And anyway, so that's part of the issue. It was a rejection of England. And if you no longer consume tea, there couldn't be a bigger slap in King George's face. So that's the first reason. The second reason, I oftentimes go back to the context because it's very, very different than today. If you think of tea, In colonial time, it was a very refined tradition. There was a protocol to it, and there was a whole slew of paraphernalia that went with the tea culture. Because if I have tea, I need to have a teapot. I need to have a tea kettle. I need to have teacups. Often the teapot and the cups were porcelain coming from China, expensive. Okay, I need to have tongs. I need to have linens. I have sugar cubes. There were all these things that went with tea. And if you and I were an average colonialist, we would not have been drinking tea because we could not have afforded it. It would have been way beyond us. You know what? In fact, the average American, infant, child, adult, was drinking in colonial America apple juice, not water. We could not drink the water in our municipalities, towns, villages, because they were so unsafe because they were contaminated. We have to remember in the 16 and 1700s, if you did have a community, that all the animals and people still had a milk cow. They still had to have a horse for transportation. They might still have a few mules just for toting things. And so all those farm critters, their waste went somewhere. Well, it was the nearest water source. And then these were still the days of a good old chamber pot. And your scullery maid, if you had one, what was the very, very first thing they did every morning? Change that chamber pot. Okay, that would go into the nearest water source. So our waters were very, very contaminated. And this is why apple juice and apples were so, so important to America in colonial times. Did you realize that in the New England states and the Mid-Atlantic states, when those colonies were formed, if you had purchased land, it was a law that you planted apple trees immediately on your land. Because an apple tree was the difference between starvation and survival. Ever heard of a man by the name of Johnny Appleseed? John Chapman from Massachusetts. And he went through West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, went up into Ontario. He went all across the Midwest and the Northwest before pioneers would go there planting apples so that they would have something when they got there. So basically what I'm saying, it was not your average colonialist who drank tea. It was not your average colonialist who started a revolution and had the political thinking and the leadership abilities and the influence and the education and the money and the means to start a revolution. See what I'm saying? The exact same people who were drinking the tea and had that culture were the very same people. The very well-bred, well-educated, those with the money who would be at the forefront of starting this revolution. And of all places, why Boston? Why didn't something very similar happen when they were going into colonial harbor cities at the same time? British merchant ships. The tea was coming from China, but they were on British ships. And why didn't this happen? The three main other harbor cities were New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Charleston, and that makes four, and I can't count. But anyway, these other four cities, why didn't the same thing happen? Well, the colonial governors of those other states never allowed the tea and those merchant ships to come even into the harbors. They were so against England by this time. But the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was much, much more sympathetic to the crown. He was very divided in his loyalties. And so he said, no, we can't offend the British. We've got to allow the ships to come into the harbor. Well, that may have been how he felt. Okay, Governor Hutchinson, you come down and you unload those ships. The merchants of Boston refused to allow any of the cargo to leave the ships. So the ship couldn't leave the harbor, and the cargo couldn't leave the ship. So we're at a complete standstill, and that becomes a big, big problem. So why Boston? It was the seat of the radical revolutionaries. Massachusetts was spearheading this. We had men like John Hancock, Sam Adams, his second cousin John Adams, who would later become president, and then we also had people like Paul Revere, and they were taking a great, great stand. We had one especially revolting man by the name of Sam Adams. You can go down the street to Food City today, and if you want to get yourself some Sam Adams brew, you still can. All right, his family had been brewers in the Boston area for many, many years. They were very, very successful, and it was Sam Adams who brewed up the idea of the Boston Tea Party. You see, Sam Adams was a very, very practical man, and his ear was always at the voice of the people. And as part of his business responsibility, he had to travel from tavern to tavern to tavern and also make sure that their brew was distributed. Well, while there, he would talk among the sailors and the workers at the dock and the everyday common people, and he'd hear all their grievances against England. Plus was the fact he didn't go alone. He had a pet dog named Q, and he was a huge Newfoundland. And that dog, somehow, Samuel Adams said he never trained him to do this, but somehow that dog knew a redcoat. And when he saw anybody that was a redcoat, he would just growl at him. Could be very, very intimidating. Plus, he took a bite or two out of a couple. Well, Sam Adams comes up with the idea of all his fellow patriots being known as the Sons of Liberty. That was also his idea. And he said, you know what? Being the Sons of Liberty, that sounds good. That sounds patriotic. It sounds a lot better than the way the British newspapers are reporting us as an unruly mob. So he wanted them to galvanize their support and identity. Something else Sam Adams did that was very, very important, and this was his idea also. We're going to have the Sons of Liberty. I'm going to correspond with leaders, patriot leaders in all the other colonies to form a chapter in each colony and each major city. And then something else I want the Sons of Liberty to do that I have started in Boston, and I think it will be quite helpful to you. You all need to have a liberty tree. Okay? So, starting in 1765, with the very, very first, very aggressive tax called the Stamp Act, is the first time that they met under this huge elm. And that elm was located near the Boston Commons. Okay? Well, in the heat of battle, the British would cut it down. And all that was left was a stump. But the Patriots were not about to be defeated, so they put a pole there, and now you met at the Liberty Pole. But in every colony, you were to have a liberty tree. And this was where you would meet and make your plans. And I want you to think about this. Remember what I said about this American character being very, very practical, and everything was for expediency. They started using natural landmarks as your meeting places. Okay? We're patriots. We are rebelling against England. That means we cannot use England's buildings to revolt, to plan, to make maneuvers. So we don't have any buildings of our own. So what are we going to do? Well, let's use something we already have and everybody knows where it's at. So there were Liberty trees and there were charter oaks, okay, all throughout this time of colonial America as a way to galvanize your support and a way to identify. And so this was another reason, because of the strong, strong support that you had in Massachusetts especially. What was England's response to the Boston Tea Party? Well, for one thing, folks, I'll tell you, it was a slow response because it took quite a while to get back to England. During this time, it would take a couple months before they realized what had happened. And when they were aware, 342 chests of British tea were tossed into the Boston Harbor. And that was $1 million worth of a commodity. And so, what did King George and the Parliament decide to do? We're going to completely close down the Boston Harbor, and we're going to make Boston suffer, and we're not reopening that harbor until all the tea is paid for. That did not work well. The second response, they issued something called the Intolerable Acts. And this was more taxation and more rules and regulations that actually, rather than helping, now those people who are on the fence and were neutral about this revolution, all of a sudden, these intolerable acts, they decided, yes, it's time. We need to revolt. And so it just put a much, much greater wedge between the colonies and England, but it had a positive effect here in that it united the colonies together much, much more. So 18 months after the Boston Tea Party, war is finally declared with England. You declare war, what do you need? An army. You need an army, and you need a commander-in-chief. And I think you know who I mean. You've probably heard of a man by the name of George Washington. George Washington already was very, very loved, very respected, and very trusted. He wasn't one of those Massachusetts hotheads, okay? And he had military experience, one of the very few that did, because he was engaged in the French and Indian War earlier. But people trusted George Washington, and even his sheer size commanded respect, because by the time he was 16, he was already 6 feet tall. He was a very, very strong man. And when he saw, too, in the French and Indian War, two soldiers fighting, they were on the same team, colonists fighting with each other, he literally picked them both up, one in each arm, and separated them. And then knocked their two heads together. He said, I'm trying to knock some sense into you. All right? But he was extremely strong. But the biggest thing, plus, of having George Washington as our first commander-in-chief, he was from the South. He was from Virginia. And the northern colonies knew if we want the support of the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia, we have got to have a Southern general. And even John Hancock and the Adams agreed to that. And so he would be made our first commander-in-chief. So you're given the responsibility of an army. But you need soldiers. And what a group of ragtag soldiers he had to work with. The very, very first of the Continental Army stations was in Cambridge. And do you know, the soldiers were supposed to show up and they're supposed to come with muskets. Many of them did not have any weaponry whatsoever. So, being our practical Americans, these farm boys showed up with pitchforks and sickles, all right, from home. There's that American practicality again. And some of the men who had never ever been to war didn't know how long they would be gone, so they brought their entire families with them, okay? So it was very hard. They didn't have uniforms, and it was like a cesspool. The outhouses, the disease, they were undisciplined. You know, if he would tell the New Jersey volunteers that they have to listen to the people from Connecticut, they said, oh no, they're not nothing but a bunch of nutmeggers, which was what people from Connecticut were called. But he said, we're not listening to them, and the Massachusetts people wouldn't listen to the people from New Jersey, and it was very, very chaotic. And this is what he was given. And he was a spit and polish military man. And so it was very hard for him. And then was the third factor. He's supposed to fight a war, and he has no artillery, no cannons. He's absolutely desperate and very, very discouraged. And there is a man who comes to his rescue, one of his soldiers, who would become a very, very loyal aide to him. His name, Henry Knox. And our town, Knoxville, is named for him. He offered to George Washington, he said, you know what? At Fort Ticonderoga, 300 miles from here, there is a reserve of cannons left over from the French and Indian War. And he said, if you want, I will go get those cannons for you. And George Washington thought, Henry, you're crazy. There's no way. There's these huge mountain gaps, the weight of the artillery, plus you're traveling through the winter 300 miles. Henry Knox, at the age of 25, he said, let me do this. I can do it. Henry Knox had a bookstore in Boston. He loved books. That was his other passion. He loved books. But from the time he was a little boy, he had all these little toy soldiers that he would play with, and then he'd read books about battles in ancient history and their maneuvering. And with his toy soldiers, he had these little teams, and they were fighting it out. He loved the military and planning maneuvers and things like that. And when George Washington saw this, he said, he might be 25, but he's going to be in charge of all the placement of all my cannons. He went to Fort Ticonderoga, and I said, by George, he got all those cannons. It only weighed 120,000 pounds. And he even exceeded what Washington wanted. He also brought, with his oxen and horses, 2,300 pounds of lead that would be melted down and would be put into bullets. So you can see when Washington becomes president why he decides to make Henry Knox the very first Secretary of War. Okay, so the war is over and we win that war. And how Washington wants to go back to Mount Vernon. He didn't really want to lead the Continental Army, but he's asked now to be our very first president. He doesn't really want to do it either, but he feels he must. It's what's best for the country. Well, I always feel sorry for poor George, because I've done a lot of studies of first mothers, of presidents and first ladies, and first children, and even I did one on first dogs and pets of people, or of presidents. And George Daddy died when he was 11 years old. He was a Virginia planter. So his mother, who was also a Martha, he married a Martha, but the mother was also a Martha. And she was a very, very large lady, and she smoked a pipe. And the people back, her colleagues back then, said most of the people were quite frightened by Martha Ball, and she would, if she thought that George was misbehaving, she always had a little knife with her, like a little, wasn't a buck knife then, but you know what I mean, a little knife. And she would just go to the nearest peach tree and she would just cut down some switches and she'd just put them to the back of his legs and his bottom. And he really had to toe the line. And she had great dreams for George. And she'd tell him what these dreams were. And she said, George, someday I dream that you will be a man of the cloth. Well, poor Mary. Because when George had to go home and say, they've elected me president, she was so disappointed. She said, President? President? You're kidding. Not a king? No, Mom, president. Well, it had to do. But she was very disappointed because he never became a preacher. So when he's sworn in and he takes the oath, that was 1789. When he's done with the oath, he adds 4 words of his own making to that oath. What are those 4 words? Anyone?
So help me God.
So help me God. Very, very good, Marcia. He added that all on his own, and there has not been a president since that has not quoted that. It was never part of the original oath. He was a humble man, and he recognized where his strength came from and who he needed to depend on. So he's president, and 10 years after that, he dies, 1799. And he has a strange request. Promise me that you will not actually bury me until I've been dead for 3 days. Why would he ask such a strange thing? It's now 1799.
Wants to make sure he's dead.
Exactly. At this time frame, and for a couple more decades into the 1800s, did you realize at this time, 1 out of every 25 people buried were buried alive? People had not heard of something known as a coma. And so if you didn't move, if you didn't talk, if you didn't sit up, and you had been sick, this is very dangerous. If you had been sick and there was no signs of life, they would have a funeral and bury you. And with so many people, 1 out of 25 being buried alive, and they know this from, sad to say, the scratch marks in the inside of the coffins. Okay, so what they started to do then, a decade or so later, when someone died, they decided we're going to tie a little string either on their finger or their toe. We're going to feed that string through the coffin up through the ground and then to a bell right next to their marker, okay? And so if you ever heard the expression saved by the bell, that's where it came from. And in case the bell was ringing at 3 a.m. in the morning, somebody needed to be at that cemetery 24/7. This is where we get the term the graveyard shift. And if you ever heard the expression that somebody is a dead ringer for somebody else that has passed on, that's where we get that expression from.
You know, there's an Appalachian tradition that's been in this area since I was a small child, that when someone passed away, you never buried the person before 3 days had passed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder if that tradition arose from what you just told us from years ago, because I know in the mountains, very much everyone was held for at least 3 days.
Yes.
And I never understood exactly why that 3 days was so perfect, but that would explain
Yes,
it.
that's exactly why, and especially in the late 1700s, there was a little girl here by the name of Cora Ogle. And her parents actually had a funeral for her. And while they were at the funeral, her aunt noticed a twitch. And then little Cora sat up. And this is also where we get the tradition of awake starting and why it's called awake. You are going to stay there, somebody 24/7 for 3 days to make sure nobody woke up. And that's why we called it awake. But I have wondered in studying some of this, why 3 days? Why did they choose those 3 days? And I know the people here had a strong faith, and I wondered if it had anything to do with, the resurrection story, but, that seemed to be nationwide, so I'm not sure why they made it 3 days. But yes, you're absolutely right.
I know in our family, and this was even in my childhood, at a death, there was always 2 nights of sitting up with the body, and on the 3rd day, there was a burial, and that was pretty typical of this area.
Yes, and burials in your home.
Yes.
I grew up in North Dakota. Both my grandparents were buried in the home on the farm that they farmed. And all the families came to them. There was no such thing as going to a funeral home or, having embalming professionally done. That was part of why it was also very, very imperative, they felt, to have the body in the ground within such a time frame. But yeah, it was really the responsibility of the family. And in each community, one of the most well-loved and respected people was the coffin maker. And many times they would not ever charge for that. They would say, "This is my gift to the family. Now we would like to do this." And sometimes when I'm on a tour, because I'll talk about the importance of the church bell tolling, and that was indication to us the death of the person and the number of years they lived. But something also that is unique to this area, if you ever go to the Museum of Appalachian Norris, you'll see these. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a death nest or a death crown. If your loved one died in your home and you had a feather pillow, and you would check their pillow the next morning, if they died in their sleep, let's say, you would very, very carefully take it apart, and you were looking for a hard little cluster that looked just like a bird's nest. But they call it a death nest or a death crown. And the tradition was that if you could find one of those, that was a sign from the Lord that your loved one was going on to heaven. As a person of faith, I really don't think that it was just a coincidence that we had men like Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and James Madison, who wrote what were called the Federalist Papers, and were also part co-writers with, not for the Declaration, but with Thomas Jefferson and other things. And it's like the Declaration was needed to bring us together and to solidify very succinctly what a whole country was thinking. And Thomas Paine would, right before this, write a book that stirred his book, Common Sense, that really did a lot to solidify Americans for the cause. But, I'm just very grateful. Thomas Jefferson, a true Renaissance man, that these men were so capable, and they were statesmen. They were not politicians. And that is a world of difference, because they did what was best for the country and the people, not for the party. And if we could only get back to that. Anita went with me to do a tour to Oak Ridge, and I had originally started doing them about 25 years ago. And on the way back, I cannot help but always say, could we repeat Oak Ridge? In that, would the people today be able to do what the people back then did? And I don't think so. Because, technologically, of course we could do it. We're far beyond that. But what these people did in terms of the sacrifice, do we have Americans today that are willing to have a meatless Monday, a weightless Wednesday, a no-gas Friday for the good of the country and the whole? No. Nor are we teaching the next generation to really know what it means to sacrifice for your country and for something bigger than yourself. And when I think of the generations today, I feel sorry for them, because many of them don't know how to live at a level bigger, for something bigger than self. And that's a really small world.
One name that you could have mentioned,
Yes.
the fellow that signed the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. And didn't he do that so he wanted King George to be able to read his name without his glasses? And led to an expression, put your John Hancock.
Exactly. Yes. I had a few more pages and I saw the time, and I figured I better wrap it up.
Don't you think that George Washington lived the ideology that he had led men toward and women toward? He actually lived that when he refused to become a king. And then that was reconfirmed when the Electoral College elected him unanimously. The only person ever elected unanimously through the Electoral College. It was a different day in our country where there was complete unity around living the ideology.
Yes, absolutely. I think he lived out the truths that he espoused, and he would always be an example. And if he wouldn't ask something of someone else that he was not willing to do. Yes, I think that's very true. Yes.
I think the founding fathers were pretty smart when they came up with the Electoral College. And I think our politicians today are extremely stupid and short-sighted to try to do away with it.
Is that a question? Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Awesome.